A police officer humiliated a young black child, forcing him to smell dirty socks and beating him, completely unaware that the boy's father was a millionaire. What unfolded next shocked everyone involved. 12-year-old Malik Johnson skated leisurely down a peaceful suburban street, his face lit up with a carefree smile. The skateboard beneath his feet gleamed in the sunlight, its vibrant design catching the attention of passers-by. Malik had received it just the day before as a birthday present from his father, and it had quickly become his most prized possession. Each push of his foot sent him gliding effortlessly along the pavement. He felt a surge of joy with every smooth turn and jump, as though the skateboard gave him a sense of boundless freedom. Malik's laughter echoed softly through the quiet streets as he tried simple tricks, his energy and enthusiasm infectious to anyone who might have been watching. It was the perfect day, until it wasn't. As Malik rounded a corner, the low rumble of a police cruiser caught his attention. The vehicle slowed down beside him, its windows partially rolled down. Inside, 2 officers sat, their expressions unreadable. Malik noticed the passenger, Officer Brian Taylor, lean forward slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto the skateboard Malik held in his hand. The car pulled over, coming to a stop just a few feet ahead of Malik. The boy hesitated, unsure of why they had stopped. Moments later, Officer Taylor stepped out, his boots crunching against the pavement as he motioned for Malik to come closer. Confused but instinctively polite, Malik obeyed, stepping off his skateboard and gripping it protectively. His heart raced slightly, though he wasn't sure why. Taylor crossed his arms as he eyed Malik up and down, his lips curling into a faint sneer. Without any pleasantries or explanation, he spoke. "Where'd you steal that skateboard from, kid?" Malik froze, blinking in shock. The officer's accusation was like a slap across his face. For a moment, he couldn't find the words to respond. His hands tightened on the skateboard as he mustered a polite reply, his voice quiet but steady. "Sir, I didn't steal it," he said. "It was my birthday yesterday, and this is my gift." Taylor raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening as if he'd heard an amusing joke. He tilted his head, stepping closer. "Nice story," he said in a tone dripping with disbelief. "Now tell me the truth. Where did you really steal it from?" The question hit Malik like a second blow. He felt his stomach twist with nervous energy, but he stood his ground. "It's not stolen," he repeated, his voice firmer this time. "My dad bought it for me. He's rich, sir." Taylor let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Rich?" he said mockingly. "Black people can't be rich." His gaze dropped to his own worn-down boots, and he gestured to them dramatically. "Look at me. I work every single day, and I'm still stuck wearing these. So don't stand there and tell me your dad is rich. Now try again." Malik's confidence wavered. He wanted to defend himself, but the officer's words left him stunned. Instead, he decided it was best to avoid confrontation. He stepped back, gripping his skateboard tightly, and began to turn away. "Hey!" Taylor's voice barked loudly, stopping Malik in his tracks. "Don't walk away when I'm talking to you." The officer stepped forward quickly, blocking Malik's path. Malik turned back reluctantly, his heart pounding. He didn't want to anger the officer further, but he couldn't shake the growing sense of danger. "I'm just trying to go home," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Taylor's lips curled into a scowl. "Didn't your father teach you to respect your elders?" Malik's fear began to give way to frustration. "My dad also taught me not to talk to bad people," he said cautiously, "or racists." The officer's face darkened instantly, his smirk disappearing. "Oh, so now you think the police are bad?" he snarled, stepping closer. "That's something a thief would say." The tension between them grew thicker. Sensing danger, Malik decided to leave. He stepped back quickly, turning his body toward the sidewalk. But before he could take another step, the officer grabbed him roughly by the arm. "You're not going anywhere," Taylor barked, his grip tightening. His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement as an idea seemed to form in his mind. With a deliberate motion, Taylor bent down and removed one of his scuffed shoes. Holding the shoe in one hand, he yanked off his sock with the other. The stench hit Malik immediately, and he instinctively recoiled. "Smell this," Taylor ordered, shoving the dirty sock toward Malik's face. Malik jerked his head away, his eyes watering. "No. Stop!" he cried, his voice breaking. But Taylor didn't stop. He forced the sock closer, laughing as Malik gagged and struggled to get away. "I said, smell it," Taylor barked, pressing the sock against the boy's nose. Malik squirmed and screamed, his cries growing louder as he choked on the foul odor. Tears streamed down Malik's face, but Taylor only laughed harder. He grabbed the boy's jaw, forcing it open, and stuffed the sock into his mouth. Malik gagged violently, his small frame trembling as he tried to pull away. The overwhelming sensation caused him to vomit, and the foul-smelling liquid stained the officer's sock. Taylor's laughter stopped abruptly. He ripped the sock from Malik's mouth and glared at him. "You dirty little brat," he snapped, slapping Malik hard across the face. "You ruined my sock." Malik collapsed onto the pavement, clutching his cheek and sobbing uncontrollably. The officer shook his head in disgust and threw the soiled sock at him. "You're not worth the trouble," he muttered before climbing back into the cruiser. The car drove off, leaving Malik alone on the sidewalk, his face streaked with tears and vomit. Malik sat there for several minutes, trembling and humiliated. Finally, he mustered the strength to pick up his skateboard and make his way home. His hands shook as he gripped the board, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. When he arrived home, his mother was immediately alarmed by his tear-streaked face and trembling hands. "Malik, what happened?" she asked, pulling him into a protective hug. Through sobs, Malik recounted everything. The accusations, the cruel remarks, and the horrific humiliation. His mother's face darkened with fury as she listened. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice shaking. She grabbed her phone and called Malik's father, David Johnson, a powerful real estate mogul. "You need to come home," she said firmly. "Right now." David Johnson's phone buzzed in his hand while he sat in his spacious corner office. His wife's name flashed across the screen, and the tone in her voice was enough to make him rise from his chair instantly. She recounted the harrowing events Malik had described, the skateboard, the accusations, and the horrifying act of humiliation with the sock. With each word, David's anger grew, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Nobody disrespects my family like that," David said quietly after hearing every detail. His words were cold and deliberate, masking the storm of fury building inside him. Without another moment's hesitation, he called for his driver and left for home. When David walked through the front door of his mansion, Malik ran to him. The boy's face was still streaked with dried tears, and his trembling hands clutched the edges of his shirt. David knelt down, placing both hands on his son's shoulders. "Tell me everything, Malik," he said, his voice soft but firm. Malik recounted the incident again, his voice shaking as he relived the humiliation. Every word landed like a blow to David's heart. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his jaw clenched tight as Malik described the officer forcing him to smell the sock, the slap, and the taunting remarks. David pulled his son into a tight hug, murmuring reassurances into his ear. When he stood, his gaze shifted to his wife, Angela, who stood nearby with a pained expression. "I'm not letting this slide," David said. "That man's going to pay for what he did." David wasted no time. His extensive network of contacts was one of his greatest assets, and within moments, he had placed a call to a trusted private investigator. "I need the identity of an officer, and I need it now," David instructed, providing a detailed description of the events and the man in question. The investigator worked swiftly. By the time David had changed into a sharp gray suit and tied his tie, his phone buzzed with a name: Officer Brian Taylor. Attached to the message was a profile photo of the officer, which David studied carefully. He ran his hand over the back of his head, taking a deep breath to steady himself before heading out the door. He wasn't just a father seeking justice for his son. He was a man with the means and resolve to ensure that justice was served. David drove himself to the police precinct, parking his luxury car in a prominent spot just outside the building. As he exited, his polished shoes clicked against the asphalt, his tall frame and commanding presence turning heads immediately. Spotting Officer Taylor leaning casually against a squad car in the parking lot, David squared his shoulders and strode directly toward him. The officer noticed David's approach and raised an eyebrow, his smirk growing wider with each step. "What's this?" Taylor asked, his tone laced with mockery. His eyes scanned David's tailored suit, and he crossed his arms. "Where'd you steal that from? You black folks always trying to look like something you're not." David stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable. Without rising to the bait, he slipped a hand into his pocket and discreetly activated a recording device. "Are you Officer Brian Taylor?" he asked evenly. The officer gave a short laugh. "Yeah, that's me. What of it?" David's voice remained steady. "Did you force my son to smell your sock?" Taylor's smirk faltered for a brief moment before returning. "If you taught your kid some respect, none of that would have happened," he said dismissively, waving a hand as though swatting away the question. David stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "I didn't ask about respect. I asked if you made my son smell your sock. Did you do it?" Taylor straightened slightly, his smirk turning into a defiant grin. "Yeah, I did. The kid was acting like a punk, so I taught him a lesson," he said. His eyes glinted with a twisted sense of pride. "What are you going to do about it?" David's lips pressed into a thin line as he studied the officer's smug expression. He took a slow step back, his eyes cold and calculating. "Thank you for making that clear," he said, his tone quiet but loaded with meaning. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his car. Taylor watched him leave, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as he realized that David had shown no outward reaction. He shrugged it off, leaning back against the cruiser and muttering to himself, "Rich boy won't do anything." Inside his car, David replayed the recorded confession, ensuring every word was clear. A grim smile played at the corners of his mouth. He dialed his lawyer, relaying the information and instructing him to prepare a formal complaint. Then he called the police department's internal affairs office, arranging a meeting with the precinct chief to report the officer's misconduct. David's hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove away, his mind focused on one thing: justice for his son. This wasn't just about Malik anymore. It was about sending a message that abuse of power and blatant prejudice would not go unanswered. David Johnson walked into the police station, his steps purposeful and his expression steely. In his hand was the evidence that would hold Officer Brian Taylor accountable for his actions. The receptionist at the front desk greeted him politely, but David's presence demanded immediate attention. Within minutes, he was ushered into the office of Chief Leonard Hayes, a man known for his dedication to professionalism in law enforcement. David placed his phone on the chief's desk and leaned forward. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Instead, he recounted Malik's ordeal in vivid detail: the accusations, the humiliation, the abuse. Chief Hayes listened intently, his face remaining stoic, though a tightening in his jaw betrayed his growing anger. When David finished, he unlocked his phone, tapped on the recording app, and pressed play. As Officer Taylor's voice crackled through the speakers, mocking Malik, the chief's face darkened. The recording captured everything: Taylor admitting to forcing the boy to smell his sock, the cruel taunts, and his open confession to teaching Malik a lesson. When the recording ended, silence hung in the air. The chief's hands clenched into fists as he processed what he had just heard. Finally, he stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. "This is completely unacceptable," the chief said, his voice sharp and filled with controlled anger. "We'll handle this immediately." He pressed a button on the intercom and summoned Officer Taylor to his office. While they waited, Chief Hayes assured David that there would be no tolerance for such behavior in his department. "Justice will be served," he promised. Moments later, the door opened, and Officer Taylor walked in, his usual smirk firmly in place. His eyes flicked between David and the chief, a trace of unease momentarily crossing his face. "What's this about?" Taylor asked, feigning ignorance as he leaned casually against the doorframe. The chief gestured for Taylor to step inside. "We have a complaint against you," he said, his tone controlled but cold. Taylor straightened, his smirk faltering. "A complaint? What for?" he asked, trying to sound incredulous. David spoke up, his voice steady but icy. He repeated the allegations against Taylor, detailing the humiliation Malik had endured. The officer scoffed, cutting him off mid-sentence. "That kid was out of line. Taylor said defensively. I was just trying to teach him some respect. Maybe if his father did his job, I wouldn't have to step in. David didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his phone, tapped the recording again, and let Taylor's own voice answer for him. The room filled with the sound of Taylor mocking Malik, his crude remarks about black people and his open admission of forcing the child to smell his sock. As the recording played, Taylor's face paled. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. When it ended, he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The chief fixed Taylor with a piercing glare. You have anything to say for yourself? He asked. Taylor hesitated for a moment before blurting out, Look, it's not what it sounds like. The kid was being a punk. He had it coming. David's expression didn't change, but his eyes bore into the officer with quiet fury. The chief leaned forward, his voice low but filled with authority. You crossed the line, Taylor. This recording is all the evidence we need to take action. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Taylor's demeanor shifted from defensive to desperate. He leaned closer to the chief, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Come on, Leonard, he said. It's just a black kid. We were just messing with him. It's not like it's a big deal. The chief recoiled as though Taylor's words had physically struck him. His face hardened, and his voice rose sharply. That's enough, he barked, his anger fully unleashed. Taylor froze, his hands trembling slightly. The chief pressed the intercom again, this time calling in 2 officers. Escort Officer Taylor to the holding cells, he ordered. What? Taylor protested, his voice rising. You can't do this. I was just doing my job. The chief ignored him, motioning for the officers to carry out the order. As they approached Taylor, he began to back away, his bravado crumbling. This is ridiculous, he shouted. You're going to take their side over mine? One of the officers grabbed Taylor's arm and placed him in handcuffs. As they led him out of the room, Taylor continued to shout, his voice growing fainter as they moved down the hallway. David watched the scene unfold with a grim expression. While seeing Taylor arrested brought a sense of relief, it wasn't enough to erase the pain Malik had endured. The chief turned back to David, his face lined with regret. I want to personally apologize to you and your son, he said. This kind of behavior has no place in our department or anywhere else. We'll ensure he faces the full consequences of his actions. David nodded curtly, his voice firm. This isn't just about my son. It's about every child who's ever been humiliated or mistreated by people like him. I expect your department to take this seriously. You have my word, the chief replied. As David left the station, he knew the fight wasn't over. Taylor's arrest was only the first step. Justice, he thought, required more than punishment. It required change. With that thought in mind, he headed home to Malik, determined to show his son that standing up for what was right could make a difference. David Johnson was resolute in his pursuit of justice for his son. The very next morning, after Officer Taylor's arrest, he formally filed charges against him. The case, already gaining significant media attention, quickly escalated into a high-profile trial. News outlets seized on the shocking details, a trusted officer abusing his authority to humiliate and traumatize a child. The public outrage was palpable, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. On the day of the trial, Malik, sitting with his family, clutched his father's hand tightly as the proceedings began. His face betrayed both nervousness and hope as he watched the lawyers present their case. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the evidence. They played the video recording David had captured, which revealed Taylor's mocking remarks about black people and his admission of forcing Malik to smell his sock. The sound of Taylor's laughter and his dismissive tone hung heavy in the air, drawing gasps and murmurs of disgust from the audience. Witness testimonies further corroborated the events. Several bystanders who had seen Malik sobbing and overheard Taylor's remarks recounted the incident in vivid detail. The defense tried to argue that Taylor's actions were exaggerated and taken out of context, but their arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Taylor's own recorded words were impossible to refute. When Taylor took the stand, his demeanor shifted from cocky to defensive. His lawyer attempted to paint him as a misunderstood officer who had simply overstepped in a moment of frustration. But Taylor's lack of remorse became evident when questioned by the prosecutor. His answers were evasive, his tone bordering on dismissive. The prosecution drove the point home. You forced a 12-year-old boy to endure an act of humiliation that no child should ever experience. Do you deny that this was motivated by your prejudiced assumptions about him? Taylor faltered, his gaze dropping. His silence spoke volumes. The judge's closing remarks were scathing. She condemned Taylor's actions as a gross abuse of power and a violation of the trust placed in law enforcement. Her words resonated throughout the courtroom. This court will not tolerate behavior that dehumanizes and traumatizes a child, especially by those sworn to protect the public, she declared. Your actions were not just criminal, they were morally reprehensible. Taylor was sentenced to 4 years in prison. In addition to the prison term, he was ordered to complete mandatory community service upon his release, specifically in programs designed to educate law enforcement on racial sensitivity and the ethics of their profession. For Malik, the trial was a pivotal moment in his journey toward healing. Sitting in the courtroom, he saw his father's relentless determination and the justice system finally holding someone accountable for wrongdoing. Though the memory of the incident lingered, the courtroom's verdict gave him a sense of closure. He leaned against his father as the sentence was read, tears streaming down his face, not just from relief, but from the realization that his voice had been heard. David, however, viewed the verdict as only the beginning. In the weeks following the trial, he used his platform and influence to advocate for systemic changes. He held press conferences, speaking out about the need for stricter accountability within law enforcement and better training programs to address implicit bias. No child should have to go through what my son endured, David said during one public statement. We must ensure that our institutions do better, not just for Malik, but for every child, every person who has faced injustice and humiliation because of prejudice. Change begins with accountability. The story sparked nationwide conversations about police conduct and racial bias. Communities rallied around the Johnson family, drawing inspiration from their resilience and determination. Advocacy groups used the case as a catalyst to push for reforms, and Malik's experience became a rallying cry for justice and equality. At home, the Johnson family worked together to support Malik's healing. His mother, ever nurturing, ensured he had a safe space to express his feelings. His father, a constant pillar of strength, reassured him that their fight wasn't just about punishment but about creating a better future. Malik began to see that his father's resolve to stand up for him was a testament to the love and pride that defined their family. The verdict and subsequent advocacy efforts left an indelible mark on the Johnson family and their community. While the trauma of the incident could never be entirely erased, the knowledge that they had fought back and won provided solace for Malik. The experience reinforced a powerful lesson his father had always taught him. Standing up to injustice, no matter how daunting, was always worth it. Disclaimer: this story is a fictional creation meant to address issues of abuse of power and highlight the importance of justice and respect for all individuals. It is not based on real events and serves as a tool to spark awareness and meaningful conversations about equality and accountability in society. Viewer discretion is advised.